Good evening. My name is Shoma Champandi, and I'm president of the University of Massachusetts Black Student Union. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all here for this evening's lecture. First, I have a little announcement I have to make. There was an event called Crossing Borders that was supposed to take place this evening at 8 p.m. in the Campus Center, room 811. It has been canceled until tomorrow evening at the same time. To begin with, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the other organizations and groups who made this evening's lecture a possibility. Most notable of these organizations and groups was the Chancellor's Office, the members of the Mission Enhancement Committee, Distinguished Visitors Program, and BMCP, Malcolm X Cultural Center, Department of Academic Support Services, and numerous other people who I've forgotten to mention, probably. I also wish to mention how deeply honored I am to have Professor Cornel West here this evening with us. It always excites me to have an opportunity to hear from a Black intellectual who's created a unique vision and view of what battles lie ahead for meaningful equality for Black people in America. This evening's lecture is perhaps backdropped and highlighted by the fact that it exists during Black History Month. During this month, we come together to honor the contributions and accomplishments of Blacks in making America what it is today. When we honor Black History Month, it's always important for us to remember that Black history and American history do not exist separately. Despite what we've been taught for many years growing up in our academic career, et cetera, Black history and American history actually are one of the same. They speak to one another. They look at each other. They question each other and remind each other that few easy answers exist to the questions sparked by race. So, in truth, when we come together to honor Black History Month, we actually come together to honor the best in all of us. Names like W.E.B. Du Bois, whom, armed with an unchallenged understanding of American history, set out to destroy the demons that existed in the minds of African Americans. Women like Ida B. Wells and Sojourner Truth, who were able to exist in a society which was both racist and sexist, and stood as shining examples of courage and commitment. Individuals like Charles Hamilton Houston, a graduate of nearby Amherst College, who, armed only with a thorough understanding of the law and history, set out to kill Jim Crow. The list of all those individuals we honor during this month goes on: Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Drew Ali, Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and countless others whose name echo in the mind and the conscience of America. But let us not forget the list of others, the names who strike no chord in our mind, the individuals who we never really think about, but they labored and sacrificed they did. People who existed as mammies, sharecroppers, and the like, who quietly, with no glory, created a foundation upon which we stand on this evening. I'd like to steal a quote from Kwasi Nkrumah, who articulated the struggle and the perseverance of these forefathers and foresisters, perhaps best. He said that at the end of their lives, in the greatest act of sacrifice and humility, they laid down their bodies to form human bridges over the vast hardship of their lives, so that you and I could cross over without having to deal with the same battles and struggles that they had so gloriously won. These human bodies now exist for you and I as guides, so that we may walk more straight. I believe that it's upon a reflection of this history and understanding of this past that we best understand and best realize the importance of the work of Dr. Cornel West. He has attempted to question accepted ways of thought and pioneer new ways to analyze the questions that are sparked by race in America. Because, as our history reminds us, and as was said so well in the title of Cornel West's most recent book, whether the date be 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, or 1994 in any town in America, race matters, and unfortunately continues to matter in America. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you Penny Cameron, who is the chairperson of our Political Action Committee of the Black Student Union. I thank you most graciously for your kind attention. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can we get that a little louder, please? Good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right, now, I'm going to read to you biography, short biography, because I know you guys want to hear Dr. West, Professor West. So, but before then, I just had to say I was hit by a few comments by what Shamwa had to say. Not only is Black History Month to honor those who go before us, but it's also to honor ourselves. You know, it's like that reward. You travel such a long road, a road that we travel 12 months of every year, and every year of every decade and century and so forth and so on. And this is our month to reward ourselves and look at the great people that has come before us and the great people that stand amongst us now, and the great people that will come. They may not always be famous. They could be our great-grandmothers, our grandmothers, and even our mothers. But everyone, each and every one of us in our own ways, we contribute to the struggle. Now, Dr. Cornel West was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 2nd, 1953. His father was a civilian Air Force administrator, his mother an elementary school teacher who would later become a principal. The West family moved a great deal and finally settled in a middle-class neighborhood in Sacramento, California. It was there that young Cornel West began what would become a lifelong habit of protest by refusing to salute the flag because of the second-class status of African Americans in this country. Robert S. Boynton's article, Princeton Public Intellectual, which appeared in the New York Times on September 15, 1991, describes several of Cornel West's early influences. As a boy, West was greatly impressed by the Baptist Church. You know, on second thought, I don't think I'm going to read this whole bio. It's a page long and it's single print. So I don't think I'm going to read it. I'm going to get to the highlights. Thank you very much. He graduated magna cum laude, wow, of Harvard University in 1973. Gotta give him his dap, yo. One of his professors called him the most intellectually aggressive and highly cerebral student that he has taught in 30 years. There better be a professor out there that say that about me. Cornel West went on to Princeton University. This is an Ivy League school, okay? Received his MA in 1975 and his PhD in 1980. Go on ahead. All right, today he is once again at Princeton as professor of religion and director of the Afro-American Studies Department, a program he was hired to revive, I wonder why. And his book credits include 9 books. I have to give him that. It's hard to write one. 9 books. 9 books, yes, you heard it from me. And I could name them all, but I ain't gonna do it. All I have to say about Cornel West is he hopes to exemplify things that I see in my peers around me today. And that's why it is my very great honor to be on the stage and to introduce Dr. Cornel West.
Penny. I appreciate that wonderful introduction, generous introduction. I think this technology has the blues already, huh? I deeply appreciate those words by Brother Shemwa. I actually could have stayed in my seat and simply listened to him lecture tonight. He got great talent. You can't but get excited when you see young black folk who are already fired up, trying to keep alive a spirit of resistance in such dark and difficult times. I get fired up. I stand here today as but a small part of a grand tradition. That tradition is, in fact, a tradition of struggle for freedom. I decided a long time ago that I was going to give my time and energy to keep alive the best of a tradition that both produced me and allows me to now be a participant in. Because it is a privilege to serve others, to hold up a bloodstained banner of those who came before. Some of the names were mentioned. Think of a Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman. Think of an Ida B. Wells Barnett or an A. Philip Randolph, or Marcus Garvey, or James Weldon Johnson, or Ella Baker, or Fannie Lou Hamer. One cannot but be dwarfed and humbled by the level of sacrifice and courage and persistence and dogged determination that they had. And it's not simply a matter of black folk. The black freedom struggle has always been a whosoever will movement. Those who are willing to meet those high standards. So you think of a Lydia Maria Child, whose text published in September of 1833 called Appeal in Favor of that class of Americans called Africans, who would spend most of her life struggling for black freedom, along with John Brown, her friend, and whose family she supported after he was executed in December of 1859. White sister, yes, serious freedom struggler. One thinks of Elijah Lovejoy shot standing on his roof, Alton, Illinois, in 1837, or Miles Horton of Highlander Center, that would learn from and was taught by the Rosa Parks and Stokely Carmichaels and Bob Moses and Diane Nash and a whole host of freedom fighters. One thinks of Asian sisters like Grace Boggs this very moment, still struggling as she grieves with the loss of her husband, James Boggs, another towering figure in the freedom struggle in the last 40 years. Brown brother like Cesar Chavez, or a Jewish brother like Rabbi David Einhorn, run out of his synagogue as he identified with the black freedom movement in Baltimore in the 1840s, or Harry Magdoff, who has helped sustain an institution like Monthly Review, has provided such great insight and courage in keeping track of the vicious ideology of white supremacy. It's a grand tradition. This is why, for me, every month is Black History Month, precisely because the black freedom struggle is one that doesn't begin February 1st and end February 28th. It's ongoing, keeping track of the psychic scars and existential bruises and silent tears and ontological wounds resulting from the white supremacist bombardment against black beauty, trying to convince black folk that we have the wrong hips and lips and hair texture and skin pigmentation. It's visceral, degrading black bodies in order to control them. Attacks on black intelligence, black capacity and black capability, and black humanity itself. For me, the black freedom struggle is precious, not simply because it keeps track those scars and bruises and wounds, but also because it's able to highlight the different forms of agency and creativity, the forms of resistance and response, such that black humanity can be affirmed in such a way that it doesn't put others down, which is a sign of not being preoccupied with those others or obsessed with those others. The best of a black freedom struggle is one that takes black humanity for granted. One does not have to prove one's humanity to anybody or anyone. It's one of the means by which one is able then to revel in the humanity of others if you actually are not insecure about your own. One sign of being excessively insecure about your own is being obsessed with the inhumanity of others, or the degree to which the others are below you, as it were. This is why the Black Freedom Movement at its best has never put whiteness on a pedestal or in the gutter. Whiteness is simply not a point of reference at all. Which means, of course, which is news to so many, given this era in which white supremacy has so fundamentally shaped our perceptions. White people are neither gods nor devils, they're just human beings. They have the capacity to engage in devilish behavior, yes, like anybody else, but just human beings. You see, for me, the black freedom struggle is a version of the radical democratic tradition. The radical democratic tradition claims that ordinary people ought to live lives of decency and dignity, and they're more likely to do that when their voices are heard at the highest level of the decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate their lives. The radical democratic tradition believes, in fact, that the extraordinariness of we ordinary people means that each and every one of us is unique and distinctive and singular and irreducible as we are. Live lives that have epic significance. Unlike the Greeks, unlike the Egyptians, unlike even those of Elizabethan England, radical tradition believes that the lives of ordinary people are shot through with a sense of the sublime and the tragic and the problematic. For most of human history, the tragic was preserved for elites only. And when you looked at the lives of ordinary people, it was confined to the comic and the idyllic, which meant you couldn't take it too seriously at all. That's one of my attractions to the Old Testament and the New, that there you actually get ordinary peoples whose lives have such value that you can see them ascend to the heights of you can see them elevate such that they become like King Lear. And you can see them fall to the depths of humiliation, so they become like Antigone, or like in the blues or in jazz, which is, of course, the grand artistic creation of ordinary people that itself is classical status, because, in fact, the quotidian, the commonplace, the ordinary is where one finds such a grand significance. There used to be a brother who played the organ at my church, Shiloh Baptist Church. We knew him as Sylvester, but he's known to the world for the genius that he is. His name is Sly Stone. He wrote a song called Everyday People. Here this genius says, I am everyday people. The rest of development picked it up and called it People Every Day, but same point. Speech, one of the most talented participants in hip-hop culture and rap music. Same point. And when we look at the history of humankind, what do we see? Well, for the most part, of course, we see ordinary people who are coerced or deferred to various sets of elites, kings and queens and prelates and potentates and barons and nobles and suzerains. One can go on and on and on. Which is another way of saying, of course, that ordinary people are usually associated in the text. Some of the most profound writers, but some of the most aristocratic writers as mob and herd and rabble, mass. And of course, the literary folk try to get fancy and talk about poisonous flies and weeds and raindrops and bacteria and vermin. That's how ordinary people are usually described in the text. So many intellectual figures of the past, which means that their humanity is rendered invisible. They simply become raw material for the sustaining, not only societies, but the grand monuments, whatever form they take. But the radical democratic tradition says, and the black freedom tradition says, these are ordinary people, and there are Promethean energies among these ordinary people, if unleashed, produce possibilities heretofore ignored and overlooked and downplayed. Let's see, in fact, the ways in which these ordinary people can govern themselves and manage themselves, have significant control over the conditions of their existence. Because when they don't have that control, they tend to catch hell. Of course, the assumption is that poor people had a voice in the condition of their existence. They wouldn't choose to be poor. Makes sense to me. I know, in fact, a number of persons who do take vows of poverty, but I don't think it's going to become a mass movement soon. People would choose to have access to food and shelter and health care and child care and decent jobs and decent education, which means that somewhere then their voices must be hemorrhaged, blocked. There's some clogging going on when we look and see ordinary people living lives of social misery, of changeable, transformable, alterable forms of social misery. So the black freedom struggle is one that has claimed that yes, we've got to project forms of self-determination and self-identity that never lose sight of the decency and dignity of ordinary people. How precious. Conditions for democracy, crucial. There must be freedom of association and expression and movement. There certainly must be separations of power to ensure mechanisms of accountability, so that those elites who are in fact elected don't in any way deploy power in arbitrary manner. Must be means by which one can institutionalize critiques of authority, be that authority white supremacy, male supremacy, unaccountable corporate elites, unaccountable bank elites, homophobic elites. How then can one sustain a black freedom struggle or a radical democratic tradition, given the fact that we must all recognize that democracies are very rare, human adventure. Usually short-lived, they tend not to last that long. And when they unravel, it usually has something to do with increasing poverty that produces escalating levels of despair and increasing paranoia that produces escalating levels of distrust. Shattering the body politic, making public life itself more and more something barren, empty, vacuous, something to run from. And to talk about race in America and in the United States is to take us to the very heart and core of the multi-layered crisis of this society, precisely because to talk about race is to talk about poverty and paranoia. many black poor people. That has always been the case. Too many poor people in general in this country and around the world, but too many black poor people. When the first skilled, proud African stepped off that slave ship, that connection to the rich heritage of the continent, the problem in part has been twofold. Too many black poor people, too much poverty. Struggles for self-love and self-affirmation such that one does not internalize the white supremacist bombardment and find oneself captive to a colonized mind and soul and body. Twofold predicament. To talk about race is to talk about despair and distrust, which is to say then that when we engage in reflection of and resistance against white supremacy, we are talking about the very heart and core of what stands in the way of a radical democratic project in this nation. Another way of putting it is to simply say that white supremacy is like a serpent wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the Declaration of Independence was signed by the founding fathers. And it haunted this experiment called America then, and it continues to haunt it 218 years later. This is why race, God bless you, is in no way a marginal affair. It's in no way a matter of the periphery of this experiment. It's not just a set of issues confined to chocolate cities. As Brother George Clinton would say it as he makes his way to University of Massachusetts Amherst on Saturday. God bless that brother. Another genius in the black musical tradition, techno-funk. But his point is real in terms of chocolate cities and vanilla suburbs. Du Bois's veil still hangs, creating such a thick wall of demarcation between black world, white world. The ways in which black people have been cast as a problem people rather than people with problems. Which is to say, the way in which the metaphor of invisibility that's been applied across the board to ordinary people targets black people in such a way that black humanity and individuality and black variety and diversity is subsumed under a homogenizing act, such that black folk constitute an undifferentiated, monolithic, homogeneous blob, which makes every black person interchangeable and substitutable, which radically calls into question then the ways in which black folk are unique among themselves and distinctive among themselves. And one can see this, be it in as trite an example as being the black student sitting in a class and issues of race emerge and everyone looks at you and says, yes, what do black people think about that? Or walking in a store and seeing Minister Louis Farrakhan on the cover of Time magazine. And white fellow citizens looking over to say, does he represent you? Are you as full of rage as he is? What have we done to you for you to feel this way? Or raising the question, what does Jesse want? What does Jesse want? If we can just find out what Jesse wants, we know what black folk really want. Same point. Same view, same orientation, same perspective. We just need one. Just snatch one out of the crowd. We have a sense of what they all hold. And when, in fact, the mainstream actually takes notice of black folk, it tends to be as exotic object or transgressive object. Still an object, still an abstraction. Exotic, oh yes, a source of my vitalization, shake it on down. I need you to keep me feeling fresh and vibrant. Love your black cultural products. It has so much energy and intensity. We like that kinetic orality, that passionate physicality, that combative spirituality. Give it to us, give it to us, give it to us. Exotic object. Or that sexual prowess. Oh my God, I can't wait. To feel alive. This is a ding-on Z. This is the real thing. Or transgressive object, source of fear, anxiety. Keep my distance. Know you have a propensity at any moment to go off. What side of the bed did you get off this morning? Transgressive. You see it in so many forms. Two dominant images these days in America. The exceptional Negro on the one hand, criminal on the other. Majority of black folk, hard working, living on the edge of poverty, very much like Rock in the television series, you see. But no, exceptional Negro. Oh, black folk are doing so well. Every time I turn on my television, I see Oprah, I see Arsenio, I see Martin, I see Living Single. They must be quite satisfied with their level of upward mobility. Or as criminal, you see, that brother on the 6 o'clock news on his way to incarceration. I was in Baltimore just last week at Maryland State Penitentiary for 4 hours. Baltimore is a city in which 57% of young brothers between 16 and 21 are either on parole, probation, or in prison. 25% national level. Baltimore is 57%. 1,860 black folk per 100,000 incarcerated in this country. Highest level in the history of the modern world, and it is increasing every day. It has much to do, of course, with the mandatory sentencing linked to cocaine. It's recently held unconstitutional by Judge Cahill. We'll see how long it holds. That's reflection and part of the despair and the paranoia, not just across black, white, black, brown, black, yellow, and black, red communities, but within the black community itself. One of the most chilling facts that I've seen recently is 42% of young black brothers between 16 and 21 report they have no best friend. What's life like without a best friend? No supportive networks, distrustful of one another. That has much to do with the high level of homicidal rates among young black brothers, of each other. Which makes it very difficult to organize and mobilize, makes it very difficult to get a movement off the ground when you have that level of distrust. Very different to the Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s, where the bonds were tighter and the possibilities of coming together were higher. Though there's so many heroic young black brothers and sisters, we'll talk about that later. Very much so. But my major point is that when we talk about race, talk about black freedom struggle, whether we like it or not, if we're concerned about empowering everyday people, ordinary people, then we're talking about ways in which they can determine their own destinies, govern themselves and manage themselves, which puts us at the center of a radical democratic project. What does it look like at present in terms of keeping alive the tradition that I'm talking about? And keep in mind, I do believe that T.S. Eliot was absolutely right when he said that tradition is not something you inherit. If you want it, you must obtain it with great labor, great service, and great sacrifice. Now, he had a different tradition in mind than I do, but the insight hits the nail on the head. What are the means by which, the conditions under which traditions that I'm talking about can be sustained, expanded. Well, let's look at present-day conditions. And I'd submit to you this evening that we're living one of the most frightening and terrifying moments in the history of this nation. Unprecedented lethal linkage of relative economic decline and undeniable cultural decay. And this peculiar political bewilderment tends to take the form of lethargy and apathy. Relative economic decline has to do, of course, with the downward mobility, the social slippage, with so many outright immiseration of millions of fellow citizens. When people are on their way down, it tends to bring out the worst in them just as it brings out the worst in us. Leaves them open to scapegoating, looking for conspiratorial theories that can account for why things are out of control. If we could just target those few who are pulling the strings from above, maybe our situation can be ameliorated. The downward mobility has so much to do, of course, with the world historical process called deindustrialization, the industrial flight that has resulted in levels of underemployment and unemployment that has produced a slow motion and silent depression that has been ravaging the chocolate cities for the last 25 or 30 years. 1960, 42% of young black men between 16 and 21 had decent paying industrial jobs. Today, 7% do. Some of them say that too. But they're usually not talking about bosses. They're talking about each other. It's part of the problem. Looking laterally and horizontally rather than looking up. I was talking to some deeply conservative white male fellow citizens in Peoria, Illinois a few weeks ago, and they were trying to convince me that black people were responsible for why the factories closed down and they lost their jobs. And I asked them, how many factories did black people own? They said, none. It was that affirmative action that really did it, she said. Got the bosses upset. Human, all too human. Blame the most vulnerable members of a community for one's own troubles. You hear these days, oh, if the women had just stayed in the kitchen, the culture would be intact. The deindustrialization pushing women into a labor force as the sexist barriers began slightly to fall as a result of blood, sweat, and tears of a feminist and womanist movement. But blaming the women. Oh, the gay brothers and lesbian sisters that just stayed in the closet, the morality would be intact. Always looking to blame those who have been cast as different, those who are degraded as other, as some explanation. Human, all too human. But the relative economic decline, of course, has to do more with the industrialization. It has much to do with the redistribution of wealth upward. What's so frightening about this moment in terms of keeping the best of the black freedom movement alive and the radical democratic tradition alive is that we've experienced massive transfers of wealth from ordinary working people to ordinary wealthy people. Corporate executive salaries increased 225% in the last 14 years when workers are laid off and plants are closed and benefits are slashed. Talk about economic recovery that affects the top 20% as their incomes augment, and yet for the most part those jobs are in Wendy's and Burger King and McDonald's with hardly any pensions, if any at all, hardly any benefits. Yes, many jobs, part-time jobs, so you need 2 or 3. There's nearly 20% of all working people in this nation at this very moment work more than 40 hours and still live in poverty, called the working poor, and don't receive a cent from the government. Not 1 penny from the government. The downsizing the American middle class, that our social structure looks less and less like a diamond and more like an hourglass. Relative economic decline. Very frightening moment in terms of trying to keep alive the best in anybody, let alone the democratic values and sensibilities that are requisite for any serious struggle. And then in addition, of course, there is the undeniable cultural decay, and this is what people are talking about these days. The levels of crime and violence, the fear of insult, attack, assault, the sense of living in such a highly crystallized market culture with market moralities and market mentalities, along with that creeping zeitgeist of cold-heartedness and mean-spiritedness that tends to go hand in hand with any culture that evolves around buying and selling and promoting and advertising and believes, in fact, that access to power and pleasure and property, sometimes by any means, is the definition of the good life. And the market mentality that feels as if we actually are at our best when we're addicted to stimulation and titillation. Down and out, go to that last semblance of public life, the mall, and consume and feel titillated, stimulated. Or turn on the television and engage in that spectatorial passivity, and with the bombardment of those moving images and sound, most of those images, degraded images of women, in order to convince us to consume as the commercials become more and more frequent. How spiritually impoverishing. Of course, the ultimate logic is simply to hook up to a pleasure machine forever. Isn't so much of the culture revolves around sexual foreplay and orgiastic intensity. Just hook up to an orgasm machine forever and be titillated and stimulated. Orgasm has its place, but diminishing returns, I would suspect most of you have recognized by now. Something called conversation, you know. That helps. Which is another way of saying that in a market culture, it becomes more and more difficult for non-market values to gain a foothold. There is no black freedom struggle without non-market values. There's no radical democratic tradition without non-market values. There's no vital public life without non-market values, on whatever level one wants to proceed. Love, care, concern, service to others. Non-market. Community. Trust. Quest for truth, even. A market metaphor like contract makes no sense without some commitment to truth-telling and promise-keeping. Without those two values, a contract is just something to manipulate in order to get over, as it were. And even in our intimate relations, values like gentleness, and kindness, and sweetness. I know when I was growing up, we used to slow dance in the garage, the Otis Redding song called Try a Little Tenderness. I like that song. It's getting at something deep. In part, of course, what he's saying was, look, no matter how wrapped up we are in ourselves and our race and our gender, that we're basically featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces. That's us. And each of us must face unavoidable and inescapable extinction of some sort, which means you're not here that long either. You need to find some meaning and value, some purpose, some direction and orientation, something beyond simply the hedonism and narcissism of what is presented as a good life in a market culture. The major institutional consequence of a market culture is the erosion of those nurturing systems that transmit non-market values. William O'Neill, one of the disciples of Arnold Toynbee, has said over and over again, a distinctive feature of the decline of every civilization, going back to the Sumerians of Mesopotamia or the Egyptians of northern Africa, is precisely the erosion of the nurturing system for children. When you're unable to transmit those levels of meaning and value, in this quest for excellence and elegance among young people, when young people reach the conclusion that, lo and behold, they themselves no longer have access to effective bonds and supportive networks, and hence they fall back on meaninglessness and hopelessness that reinforces an aggressive instinct, and the market forces that hollow out neighborhoods, communities, families, are replaced by buying, selling, promoting, advertising. One of the most telling moments in the 1980s was when they deregulated television. Some of you might remember that. You might recall that moment. They actually had a press conference, 1981, and they asked Mr. Fowler, well, what about the children? And he said, the marketplace will take care of the children. And in so many ways, he's sadly right. 21.8 hours of young people looking at television, 1.8 reading, 3.8 homework. Market will take care of the children. Oftentimes this is talked about in terms of the family and the crisis of the family, especially those families that are headed by women, especially those women who have illegitimate, quote unquote, children. You say, oh, what an excuse in order to deal with the systemic cultural decay. When the nuclear family was in place, two people never were the only ones who raised children. You needed aunts and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers and little league coaches and dance teachers and rabbis and Sunday school teachers and ministers at the mosque. You needed a whole web, a whole network of persons to raise children. You all know the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. What we're talking about is not simply the crisis in the family. 70% of white male professionals divorce. 72% of black men in inner cities divorce. It's a national phenomenon, which is reflective of the deeper issue of how does one gain access to effective bonds and supportive networks? Where does the love come from? Crucial question. Donny Hathaway and Roberta Flack raised it with great perspicacity in the 1970s, didn't they? Where is the love? Where's the affection? The affirmation? The very sources of self-confidence that are requisite for every person to make it from womb to tomb, and if they don't, they more and more feel as if they are not worth anything. If they think they are not worth anything, then they will reach the conclusion that you are not either, including your property. Cultural decay, layered by that legacy of white supremacy in which, as Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton in their recent text point out, we live in more de facto segregated conditions now than we did in the 60s. The balkanization of space, the balkanization of social life, the balkanization of association per se, which makes it very difficult for there to be any fundamental acknowledgement of what holds a body politic together, called the public. The hollowing out of the public. And when we think of public life in America, we must also acknowledge the ways in which it is so thoroughly racialized, which is to say associated with black and brown peoples. Think of public education, especially from K to 12, very much a black and brown affair. Something to run from. Think of public provisions. We don't think of subsidies to corporations. We think of welfare, so thoroughly racialized and gendered. You think of that most vicious of metaphors, a welfare queen. One looks at the history of black women in this country. One of the, if not the hardest working group in the history of this nation, associated with ripping off the U.S. nation state. 1900, 70% of black women were working in white households, raising white kids as well as raising their own. In 1946, it was still 42% of black women working in white households, raising white children as well as their own. And they're associated with being lazy, idle, shiftless. If this is not the embodiment of the Protestant ethic, deferring gratification, being thrifty and frugal, I don't know what group could make such a claim. But public provisions, racialized. And one could go on to public transportation and public safety, linked to black males again. And most importantly for us here in the institution of higher learning, public conversation. What happens when society begins to lose the art of public conversation, that precious activity of communicating with one another as citizens, mediated with mutual respect and civility? How rare that is these days. Most public conversation takes the form of name-calling and finger-pointing. The clash of identities and constituencies and clienteles, the very notion of public-mindedness, again, like so many other non-market values, push to the margins. Even persons these days who talk about public-mindedness and public conversation, they say, have you lost your mind? There's no such thing. It's all about my agenda and yours clashing. Martin Buber used to say that you ought to be a little different when you leave dialogue than when you entered. How rare that is these days. Listening, summoning, exchanging, overlapping, agreeing to disagree. This is true within respective communities. Within the black community, for example, where there is such a need for serious public conversation of all the various spokespersons and leaders. This is true across communities of black and white and black and brown and black and yellow and black and red, black and Jewish and so forth. You see? John Dewey said it well in his classic of 1927, The Public and Its Problems. He said, one sure sign of the decay of democracy is when, in fact, citizens lose a sense of public conversation and public life, which means they lose their conception of what it is to be a citizen. And a citizen is simply an ordinary person capable of ruling or being ruled in turn, as Aristotle defined it. An ordinary person capable of giving judgments and holding office. But what happens in such a moment? Well, as you can imagine, that peculiar political bewilderment, which is to say, begin to lose confidence in the ability of public institutions to do anything right. Cynicism, fatalism, pessimism about public life. And the best example of that would be Los Angeles 1 year after the uprising. It was city, public problems, truncated public life. Just got a downtown a few decades ago. And the response is what? Thoroughly privatistic. I'll get my gun, you get yours. Dodge City. Hobbesian war of all against all. You see? What an omen. What are we to do? Well, one is to recognize that, lo and behold, fundamental litmus test of this society has always been its ability to engage in critical and frank conversation about the legacy of white supremacy. has avoided it, evaded it the last 15 years. Under the aegis of conservative elites in Washington, given the levels of unity and consolidation of business elites in this nation, it rendered so much of the effects of white supremacy invisible, as if it didn't exist. And what did that do? It reinforced the deep pessimism in the black community regarding America's will to racial justice. Reinforced the closing rates mentality. Can't trust anybody but ourselves. We've got to close ranks and try to do for own black self-help and black self-development. Nothing wrong with it, but history is not what you wish in terms of what the challenges are. All of black self-development and self-help in the world still cannot deal with the depths of black social misery, given the ways in which the destinies of black folk are inextricably interwoven with those of others in this nation and world. I'm all for the augmentation of the black business class and the black entrepreneurial class, the black business nationalism associated oftentimes with Minister Louis Farrakhan. Nothing wrong with more black businessmen and women. But don't be deluded to think that that in and of itself could deal with the level of unemployment and underemployment of brothers and sisters in the chocolate cities. One factor among others. We've got to deal with the fact that 1% of folk in this nation own 48% of the financial net wealth. 1% own 36% of the household net wealth. 45% of the population own 2% of the wealth, but it's unconstitutional for the federal government to tax wealth. They can only tax income. Let's have a public debate. Let's put that on Oprah. Let's see what people think about that. Meaning what? Again, Martin King was right. We're all a part of one garment of destiny to the degree to which history has bequeathed to us placement on a boat, same turbulent sea, and it's got a big leak in it, and we go up together or we go down together. You might not like the fact that there will be others who you don't like, you have to work with, but history is not about wishes. History is about struggle. It's about focusing on problems, crises. Which means for me then to talk about black freedom struggle and keep alive the radical democratic tradition means that we have to revitalize public life, beginning with revitalization of public conversation, focusing on problems that we have overlooked. And you do that not simply by creating more and more talking heads on television so that you end up with televisual visibility. You do that by trying to energize and galvanize people so they can engage in forms of organizing and mobilizing to bring power and pressure to bear on prevailing status quo. Conversation is a form of struggle. It's not chit-chat. There's always tension. There's always friction in serious forms of struggle, but you're focusing on something bigger than you. Like the state of our children, ecological abuse, or the levels of inability of workers to organize themselves against tremendous power of management, or the levels of patriarchal authority wielded, often resulting in increasing sexual abuse and rape and sexual violation, vicious attacks on gay brothers and lesbian sisters. Fundamental challenge. In conclusion, how does one talk about and go about revitalizing public life? Well, first, we need something deeply un-American, which is a sense of history. A deep sense of history, a tragic sense of history that explores the possibilities of human action against the limits, but the limits we do not know where they rest. And that sense of history would allow us to acknowledge ambiguous legacies, and those ambiguous legacies means then that no group of society or civilization has a monopoly on truth or virtue or wisdom. No melodramatic conceptions of history in which all the good are on one side and all the bad are on the others, and we're waiting for the happy ending. Usually with the storyteller at the top as ruler, who doesn't like to rotate. How anti-democratic. a tragic sense of history. It talks about hybrid cultures, ways in which the cross-cultural fertilization has produced the kind of civilization in this new world is profoundly African, profoundly linked to struggles of indigenous peoples, profoundly linked to a variety of different Europeans who have subsumed themselves under an ideology called whiteness, and so thoroughly convinced themselves that they're white that they think multiculturalism is just about race and black folk, rather than the variety of different cultures among Euro-Americans. How powerful this ideology of positively charged whiteness and negatively debased blackness has been and still is in this nation. Sense of history will explode the various white supremacist lies told about the past, and the male supremacist lies told about the past, simply in the name of truth and knowledge. Just putting forward the evidence, making the inferences. It's not a matter of psychological sensitivity. It's not a matter of adding on to groups because the demographics have changed. No. That the old paradigms simply were and are inadequate. Too many silences, too many blindnesses, too many exclusions. We're talking about quest for truth and knowledge here. One would hope that with a deep and abiding sense of history, it would generate an expansion of empathy, expansion of the scope of empathy. Simone Weil put it so well when she had said, love of thy neighbor in all of its fullness means being able to say to him or her, what are you going through? I don't have any idea what it's like to walk a mile in your shoes and get inside your skin and identify with your anxieties and insecurities unless I have some notion of what you are up against, what the circumstances and conditions are that you're coping with. History goes hand in hand with empathy in that sense. If we're going to revitalize public life, it means also let's talk about something called courage, and courage especially in the form of self-criticism. It's so easy to be self-righteous, usually the sign of a coward. Self-criticism is about courage, deep courage. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living, and Malcolm X adds the examined life is painful. It takes courage to radically call into question your own views about the world and admit that you just might be wrong. Another way of putting it is not simply the courage of having one's own convictions, but also at times the courage to attack your convictions. That's Malcolm X. He says, my life has been a chronology of changes. I had to grow, mature, develop by means of self-criticism, and it is in no way a cheaply academic activity. Because when you're serious about self-criticism, it is self-involved in self-investment. You are at the edge of life's abyss, but you're still calling yourself into question to the degree to which you feel that you can grow and mature and develop. How real, how crucial for public conversation. And what a challenge. It means then one has to cut against the grain, to go against the odds within one's own respective community and in the larger communities. It means that white folk have to cut against the grain in terms of the deeply seated white supremacist sensibilities in their own communities, which is to say to get in contact with the anti-racist legacy within Euro-America. If you lose that legacy, you're dangling. It means that brothers of all colors have to be serious about patriarchy, not because feminism is fashionable or faddish, but rather because the black freedom struggle and radical democratic tradition is oxymoronic without acknowledging the humanity of 52% of humankind. It means that straights must never lose contact with the humanity of gays and lesbians. which is to say radically cut against the grain, which means we've got to keep track of the plight and predicament of working people in a moment in which elites are so thoroughly unaccountable that they can wield their power and wealth in shaping the agenda of this nation without any serious opposition. Cut against the grain. It's tough. This is why when one engages in this sort of language and talk, it means in the end that we have to have some sense of audacious hope, which is to say there's always a spiritual dimension. And of course, one recognizes this when one looks at the history of the black freedom struggle. I don't know of an institution or organization or movement among black people that will ever take hold without deep spirituality and usually taking the form of a love of music and its performance. Why? Because when we look at people of African descent in this nation, these are a people history has pushed their backs against the wall and life has often knocked them to their knees, but they refuse to allow misery the last word, even if all they can do is sing a song or say a prayer or preach a sermon or just laugh at the sheer absurdity, the arbitrariness and capriciousness and irrationality of white supremacy. Just laugh the way Richard Pryor used to just laugh at it. Look at this pathology. Look how sick this is. Spiritual in the sense that it's a form of resistance and it sustains that most crucial of qualities, that intangible characteristic called hope. An audacious hope, and it has nothing to do with optimism. Black people have never been optimistic, thinking that there's enough evidence out there to allow us to infer that things are going to get better. No, no such thing. Black people have been holding on to hope. That's something else. That's a leap of faith beyond the evidence that creates new evidence, that provides means by which people can create new bonds of trust and empowerment, forms of equipment and enablement. That's what we're so deeply in need of today. In the black community, within the larger national, international communities, an audacious sense of hope. Because any time everyday people reach the conclusion that the world really is incomplete, not closed in on them, or that history is unfinished, not so thoroughly stacked against them they can't move, or the future is open-ended rather than prematurely closed, then elites began to shake in their boots of all sorts. When in fact we reached a conclusion as we keep alive the black freedom struggle and radical democratic tradition, that it is in one sense always dawn and the day breaks forever and above the eastern horizon at this very moment somewhere the sun is about to peep, and seize that opportunity. We would begin to exemplify in our own praxis, intellectually, politically, socially, existentially, personally. When Earth, Wind, and Fire sang, "Keep your head to the sky," or when Mahalia Jackson sang, "Keep your hand on the plow," or when freedom fighters in the 1960s all sang, "Keep your eyes not on each other, but on the prize," that we can make that tangible and concrete. Usually in America, it happens about every 35 years or so, and ordinary folk reach that conclusion such that new progressive and prophetic energies begin to flow. Will it happen again in the 1990s? Open question, but there's no doubt that many in this audience and myself will be fighting and will go down fighting and will do it in the name of the Fannie Lou Hamers and the El Hajj Malik El Shabazes and others who did what they'd had to do in their time to keep these rich traditions alive. Thank you all so very much.
Well, at this time, we have a microphone right up in the front here where we'd like people to come up with questions for Mr. Cornel West. So if you could just form a line behind the microphone and ask Mr. West some questions.
Thank you very much. Sorry to go on so long, though, but don't hesitate to ask questions or queries and so forth. Very much so. How you doing there, man?
All right, what's up? I just got in here a little bit late, but I caught the last bit of what you were saying. About 2 weeks ago, Professor Karenga from California, I think an institution out there, spoke. I was curious to find out what you thought Kwanzaa was all about and your views on that through his interpretation, if you would, listen to him speak.
Oh yeah, no, Brother Milana's a close friend though. I go out to his center quite often. Kwanzaa, of course, is the brainchild of Brother Milana, and it's a means by which so much of the black love and black care and black concern is institutionalized, such that every year black folk come together and try to keep alive collective memory. I think it's a very important institution that's become more and more popular these days, as you know. Now, it's linked to a much larger project. As you know, Milana is a particular kind of cultural nationalist, a very sophisticated kind of cultural nationalist. And therefore, Kwanzaa for him is linked to a much more larger political project. That he's part of a tradition, a very integral part of the black freedom struggle, of a black nationalist tradition that claims, in fact, that there are good reasons for deep pessimism about engaging prematurely in multiracial alliances and coalitions, and therefore one has to try to cultivate black spaces to increase black consciousness, to deal with the acceptance of white supremacist perceptions of oneself, at body, soul, mind, and so on, and then move forward into multiracial alliances and coalitions. This is what I mean by sophisticated cultural nationalists. Unsophisticated never get to the multiracial alliances at all. And I viewed it as unsophisticated because then it becomes very difficult how they're actually going to deal with transforming black social misery without the alliances and coalitions given the situation. So that Brother Milana and myself have significant overlap. See, my problem is that I am suspicious of any form of nationalism. Any form. I don't know of a form of nationalism that is not deeply patriarchal, that produces machismo identity so the men protect women, land, property, be they with armies, navies, air force, and therefore want to run things too, as patriarchal elites. I don't know of a form of nationalism that is not in some way predicated on a degraded other. That doesn't mean that nationalism doesn't have progressive possibilities, but you got to squeeze hard, very hard, to come up with a depatriarchalized form of nationalism, an egalitarian nationalism, and a nationalism that is universalistic in terms of keeping track of the humanity of every person across the region and race and nation. You see. So most nationalism I'm deeply suspicious of. So then when I look at black nationalism, what do I see? Well, I see gallant attempts to create a sense of peoplehood among a people who the U.S. nation state itself has, for the most part, failed to protect. But no land. So a nationalism with no land goes psychological, right? Well, it's all in the mind. It's a matter of consciousness, not a matter of territory. And that's usually the form that black nationalism takes. Even like Minister Louis Farrakhan, right? Exemplar of black nationalism, right? Talks about a nation, he wants a separate nation, but he knows for the moment that's far-fetched, so it's a matter of the mind and creating business possibilities within black communities. Nothing wrong with that, but still deep limits. And of course, the seductions of, talk about degraded others, the seductions of xenophobia, and the patriarchy that shot through the organization of the nationalist movement. And that's true for any form of nationalism, not just Nation of Islam, you see. And I'm deeply suspicious of it. I know I have to work with nationalism. because we live in a world in which nationalism is the most powerful ideology of the 20th century. So you have to work with it. But I refuse to simply, as you can imagine, be captive to it. I have to work through it. You see, so as a radical Democrat in the black freedom struggle, I'm always critical of any form of nationalism that subordinates women, that talks about issues of black business, but it doesn't get at the situation of the poorest of the poor among black people. You see? And also, of course, marginalizes the James Baldwins and Audre Lordes. You see what I'm saying, no, brother? So that it's a long answer, and I do appreciate the question, because Malana is a sophisticated cultural nationalist, which is to say he would accept much of what I am saying, not all, but much, and then say, okay, Brother West, let's fuse where we agree and have fission where we disagree. I say, that's fine with me, Malana. We still part of the black freedom struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I never thought that I was going to hear a speech where quotes were taken from Socrates and W.E.B. Du Bois, along with George Clinton. And I very much enjoyed it, and want to thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope you get a chance to see George when he comes, though. Oh, you'll be in New York? No, he's already been in New York last month, yeah. New album just came out, as you know. Yeah, go right ahead.
How you doing, Professor West? Can you expand upon what you termed non-market values to us, and tell us how can we bring those non-market values to the market?
Yes, I appreciate the question. Well, one is that markets these days are ubiquitous. The whole globe is being commodified, which is to say then we have to use the market for non-market purposes. And one can engage in critiques of the market by means of the market. We see that, for example, Arrested Development in hip-hop. It's one example among others. I actually like this film I saw the other day in a hotel called Grand Canyon. I know I'm behind, but I actually like that film. And what was fascinating about it was that I saw it attempting to be critical of the market character of filmic representations and practices by means of filmic representations and practices. And that's very much what one has to do. For example, the same kind of ideas, for example, that one sees within the cooperative movement among black freedom fighters that goes back to farmers in the South through Honorable Elijah Muhammad's movement, in which you engage in black business development as a cooperative in order to promote community development, rather than just private profits for a small slice at the top. They're using the markets, they're producing products that must be sold, and so forth. But it's investing in community, you see. And so I don't in any way want to give the impression that we can just escape markets. See, not at all. Not at all. The question is, how does one work through those markets? And in addition, of course, is how are they regulated? How are they regulated by public institutions, government, and so on, you see. So that's very much what I have in mind when I talk about non-market values in relation to market. Thank you very much, sir.
Good evening, Dr. West.
How you doing? Good to see you there, brother.
In January, I went to the conference on black women in the academy, and there were a number of criticisms there of your work. Race Matters presented, and so I wanted to give you a chance to respond to them here.
I appreciate your missionary work, though.
One of the larger critiques was that in terms of your ideas on black intellectuals, you were mainly talking about black males, and in terms of W.E.B. Du Bois, you reduced Du Bois to the fact that he wore a suit. Now, I'm not here to judge you. I don't have the moral grounds to judge you or anything like that, but I think it's important that when we hear these things, we present them to people and tell people what we see. So in response to these questions, can you talk a little bit more about how we can make these criticisms, and they're serious criticisms, but do so in dialogue, a la what you've talked about, what bell hooks have talked about, what somebody like Paulo Freire has talked about.
Yes, I deeply appreciate that, though. I mean, one is, in our book, Breaking Bread, you might recall at the very end of that book, bell hooks puts forward a devastating and thoroughly persuasive critique of my male bias in an essay I wrote in 1985. And I learned from her, you So if I were to write that essay in 1994, after interacting with Bell and learning from Bell and working with Bell and writing the book with Bell, I would be different. Very much so. So I think that in that regard, her essay is called, mine was A Crisis of Black Intellectual, and hers was the Black Woman Intellectual, I think it was, in that last essay. It's just a powerful, I mean, it pulls the rug from under so much of what I was formulating in terms of my own talk about myself, because I was really talking about my own trajectory, my own journey and pilgrimage, you see. Now, in terms of reducing Du Bois to a suit, I think that is difficult to sustain if one looks at other texts. There's a chapter on W.B. Du Bois in American Evasion of Philosophy where I talk about his essay, The Damnation of Women, for example. And actually, not just quote from the essay, but talk about how rare it is that one sees someone in his day engaging in such a thoroughgoing critique of patriarchy, both within the black community and outside. And I view that as one of the sources of deep insight in Du Bois. So in that regard, if one actually read just the Crisis of Black Leadership chapter in Race Matters, then I could see someone possibly making that reduction. But it is such an uncharitable reading. I'm quite interested to find out who put forward some of these claims. But you know, you'd have to say, okay, I can understand one making that kind of claim based on just those few sentences. I mean, I'll give you another example. I have the same reaction when people talk about Afrocentrism. They say, you know, I have deep problems with your critique of Afrocentrism. And I said, I've never written on Afrocentrism other than 2 sentences in Race Matters, you see. And there I said what I'd say about most forms of black nationalism. Issues of class, gender, sexual orientation, and the difficulty of trying to not leave one person behind in the black community, no matter who they are. But that's not a critique, that's a gesture. That's 2 sentences, you see. Now, it's incumbent upon me to say, okay, and Malefi Asante and I, Professor Asante and I have debated many times, and we right now are teaching 300 black preachers in Dayton, Ohio. Orally, we have a chance to go at it, hours. More than just those 2 sentences. But then folk come up to me, oh, you're devastating or you're unconvincing critique. I said, it's not a critique, it's a gesture. I haven't written a critique yet, you see. I have to say so much more. Talk about all the varieties of Afrocentrism, and I always begin with the positive. You see, I'm a Christian, you see. I begin with affirmation and then negation, and then look for where we go from after that, so that I would want to say that it is difficult to try to tease out these broader claims in light of such a very brief treatment. That's why Race Matters, in a way, is not the best place to begin if one's talking about a larger corpus. But it is the place to begin for people whose lives are fast and short and only want to read one book of mine rather than the other. But I appreciate your remark.
Hi, I wanted to ask you to comment in a bit more detail on your frequent invocation of the term radical democracy. And I appreciate you reformulating this term in terms of the black freedom struggle in the United States. But your invocation of it immediately set bells in my mind of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe's text, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, in which they use the term radical democracy as the basis of a theoretical venture, et cetera, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And they explicitly situate themselves in a post-Marxist terrain where they, in effect, do exactly what you mentioned during this presentation, which is rejecting the so-called old paradigms for social change. And obviously Marxism principle among them. And so I was wondering if you could comment on your particular use of this term, radical democracy, and then also perhaps could confront some of the silences within that conception itself. Say, for example, I see an inconsistency between invoking radical democracy and and also invoking the Black Panthers, who certainly were, I mean, anyone who takes more than a glance at the Black Panthers see that they're a highly socialist oriented party. And so I think that also principally because you're also a noted commentator on Marxism, I think it'd be interesting if you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I mean, I also speak as one honorary chairperson of the Democratic Socialists of America. I am a socialist. I'm an improvisational socialist, which is to say that radical democracy is the major benchmark against which I measure any experimental efforts of creating new forms of social arrangements. But I hold on to socialists because I am thoroughly convinced that the Marxist tradition is absolutely right when they argue that the rule of capital is a major impediment of ordinary people living lives of decency and dignity. And by rule of capital, I mean that interlocking set of business and bank elites who have a disproportionate amount of power and wealth and prestige in our society. Now it's true that Chantal Mouffe and Lester Laclau and others, I think, tend to downplay some of the analytical work that the Marxist tradition wants to do, which is to say, to keep in front of us the rule of capital and the ways in which white supremacist elites and the ways in which male supremacist elites and others intertwine within that rule of capital. So that, for example, when I talk about 1% of the population owning 48% of total financial wealth, that's oligarchy, that's plutocracy. To some degree, that is pigmentocracy, you see. But we have to have ways in which we're able to look at the intersections of male supremacy, white supremacy, and this rule of capital, because there are going to be some black ones that come in. And most of them will not act radically different. They will act different to the degree to which white supremacy affects them within that context of elite status. But they won't act radically different for the most part in terms of trying to fundamentally transform that. Now see, I live in Ethiopia for 2.5 months of the year. All black. Unaccountable elite. Got a problem. Need for democratization. And of course, Mengistu just booted out in May of 1991, and therefore the whole new possibility in terms of trying to institutionalize the conditions of democracy, writing a constitution, setting up rule of law, and so forth and so on. And there we have similar kind of problems in terms of how do we ensure that 92% of the population involved in agricultural production themselves have some control over the condition of their existence, given international markets, IMF, World Bank, given the leadership in place, given the balkanization that's taking place there among the 76 different groups and so forth and so on. It's a whole different set of problems, but the project is the same. So when I go to Addis Ababa, I just got another radical democratic project to get off the ground in a very different context. One of the most impoverished nations, but one of the most culturally rich nations in the world, leaving the richest nation in the world in deep cultural decay. You see? So that for me, the Marxist tradition remains very important, but of course, no tradition ought to be fetishized or viewed as any idol in terms of having a monopoly on insight. One pulls from a variety of different traditions in order to gain the kind of intellectual weaponry that's necessary for struggle. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that most of those African freedom fighters who emerged in the last 40 years, Cabral and Nkrumah, Lumumba, they knew that they had to go through the Marxist tradition, even as that tradition itself could not get at the depths of what the scars produced by white supremacy were, let alone male supremacy. Yes. How you doing today?
Hi. Professor West, before I raise my question tonight, I'd like to say thank you for including in your lecture tonight a discussion of the broader issues regarding oppression. I think it's important and encouraging when African American men think beyond issues of race and include issues, or at least consider issues of sex, gender, class, sexual orientation. I do also appreciate where you've moved, I guess, from 1984 to today. and I'm looking forward to seeing your work in the year 2014.
That's right. I still got a lot of moving to do, actually. I appreciate it. Yeah.
One of the things I've noticed recently in academia and also in the media is a tendency to make a link or to draw connections between poverty and morality, such that we often are led to believe that poor people don't have good morals, or at least good family values.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like for you to comment on that if you can.
I appreciate the question and a very kind comment as well. As you know, there's a long history of trying to reduce issues of poverty to the moral behavior of those who are impoverished. It is a typical conservative gesture that downplays the circumstances and conditions under which impoverished people must struggle, and becomes an easy excuse to absolve those who are powerful of any significant civic responsibility or social accountability. Typical gesture. We can go back to almost any period in which you see debates about poor people, as far back as one wants to go, you see. The challenge, though, becomes how do we talk about the relation of poverty and what I'm calling cultural decay so that we don't fall into any narrow moralistic traps. Because, I mean, I do believe that, the black community I grew up in which, we fought with fists, not guns, in which, even given our patriarchal socialization, that we did not so thoroughly reduce women's bodies to simply objects of pleasure. We did, Smokey Robinson did, but it's different than some of the raw rap these days. On a continuum, still patriarchal. But there's a difference between patriarchal sensibility and misogyny. You see, there's a difference between sliding down a slippery slope in which the sense of treating others of some worth, as opposed to simply engaging in sheer manipulation of others. And that cultural decay for me must be understood institutionally and structurally, rather than in terms of simply individual morality. Once communities collapse, and those bonds collapse that I was talking about, then you end up with persons who feel themselves living lives of despair and so forth, and thereby give up on certain other moral codes. I mean, for example, we talk about the history of gangs, and we had gangs when we were growing up in California, and certain elements of Black Panther Party was able to politicize these gangs. But none of these gangs in the 1960s would sell drugs to children under 13. They start now at 4 or 5 years old. There's been a transformation of the moral code among gangs in terms of their relation to market forces. That's what I call decay. See? It doesn't mean that things were so wonderful then. I'm not nostalgic in that sense, which again is a deeply conservative gesture. But I recognize a difference. And that difference must be accounted for institutionally, structurally, and manifest in the kinds of individual choices that people make in light of the limited options available to them. So I think we should always be suspicious of reducing poverty simply to morality. But there is, in fact, a moral dimension that we must not lose sight of as we engage in our institutional and structural analysis. And that's a challenge. That's like walking a slippery tightrope. Very much so. Thanks so much, sir. Mm-hmm. How you doing?
Fine, thank you, Dr. West. Thank you. Before I start, I'd like to thank you very much for your very inspiring writings. One of the things that really inspired me recently was I read one of your essays in a book on essays on Malcolm X.
Oh, yes. Joe Wood's
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And one of the really inspiring things you wrote there was that we should keep our eyes on the prize and not on our oppressor. Mm-hmm. I come from a Filipino background. But the question of psychic regeneration is a very important question because my culture for a long time exalted all the European contributions to the point where my parents did believe that as Roman Catholic, God was a white person. Now, and I could see a lot of that writings on changing one's side, and I'd like to say it was very liberating, a lot of things that you wrote and said about affirming one's humanity. The question I'd like to ask, though, after thanking you for helping me spiritually, and I thank you for bringing the question spirit, is I'm a graduate student right now teaching a course in the economics department on the political economy of racism. And one of my students asked a very insightful question, and something that I've been grappling. This is the third semester I'm teaching the course for some time. She said in the middle of the course, you've been teaching us, presenting, the segregation, from segregation, etc., redlining, all these problems. But you're not talking to us about the solutions of what have to be done. That's what she told me. Tell us what solutions can be done. So I did talk a little about what was done in the civil rights movement when people came together, ordinary people, as you say, and made change happen. And a little bit about also things aside from the social level, what has to happen on the individual level. And some of this you talk about in liberating oneself and looking at the humanity of all, right? But I did realize that the books I was reading often don't really talk specifically of what must be done as solutions to move forward. And so I was wondering if I could ask you if you could enlighten us on perhaps what should I tell my students and what can be done in terms of helping and inspiring them to do something. And thank you very much for coming, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Don. Very, very good question. Kind comment. Very much so. My own 3-step program is first we've got to bend consumption to investment, because when I talk about rejuvenating public conversation and public life, it means that we have to talk about physical investment, civic infrastructure, physical infrastructure and civic infrastructure and intellectual infrastructure, which is investment of resources. And that already has to do with reshaping priorities and a new vision in communities, workplace, education. Step 2, we have to restructure the wage system, beginning with significant increase in minimum wage. Lift that 18% I was talking about out of poverty. You see. Step 3, we need a direct taxation on wealth. Okay. That's going to be serious, very serious. And make sure that that wealth doesn't leave the country, as it often does. Wealth is so clever, ingenious. And it's a very difficult question, because there's certain constitutional constraints, the counter majoritarian institutions that have played an important role, but also can be forces of reaction. And the democratic procedures that themselves are so deeply shaped by wealth and power that can be easily manipulated. And so for me, any serious talk about radical democratization of this society has to take those forms. Now, black and brown people will disproportionately benefit from what I'm talking about. No doubt about it. Because they bear the social costs of having a public life associated with squalor. We're in a public institution. Look at the budgetary cuts that you all got to deal with. This is a crime and a shame. You see. Yet at the same time, this cannot be done without first providing alternative visions and analysis in the public conversation, then focusing those visions and analysis on specific issues like healthcare, for example, and then ultimately we need institutional vehicles. Pre-party formations, parties like the New Party. I'm also very much a proponent of the New Party that Joel Rogers and others have been pushing in the last few years. So you need all 3 of those levels. You need the voices out there, the voices that at least attempt to speak with an integrity and a certain character. And then you need the link between vision, analysis, and specific issues, so it begins to take hold in people's everyday lives, so they don't just catch the vision, but can see the connection the level of their lived experience. And then you need the organizations, which means you either revitalize the old ones. I mean, now Ben Chavis, very progressive brother, head of the NAACP, new possibilities now. New possibilities now. Or you call for new ones. I mean, one sign, especially young people, of political maturity is always the creation of new organizations of young people, like SNCC and SDS and Black Panther Party. You see, this is the thing that I say over and over again to young people who say, you know, that older generation stuff you talking about and King's legacy, that's played out. We into something new. I said, well, okay, well, let me see you organize and sustain it for a while and produce some effects. Not just market rage, the way hip-hop does. You see? Not just raise consciousness, which is very important, the way hip-hop does, but organize on the ground, on your own, and tell us older folk to kiss your so-and-so. That's fine. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Because once you get involved in struggle, you begin to see that there's wisdom to be gained. And you say, oh my God, we told the old folk to kiss our behind, but lo and behold, we got a problem now that the insight they put forward before is very useful. It becomes humbling too, you see, in that regard. And that's true for every generation. Black Panther Party had the same thing. Main reason why I couldn't join the Black Panther Party because they were so hard on the church. Every week you used to have handkerchief head nigga of the week. Always a black preacher. Many of the preachers deserve to be handkerchief head nigga of the week, but it was a monolithic critique. And then when they decided, well, we want community services where we have to create some institution and the only spaces we have in the black community that's owned by black people are black churches. Reverend Johnson, can we borrow your social hall, please? Even though you were handkerchief head nigga of the week last week. See what I mean? You come back, you see? You come back. That doesn't mean that their critique of Reverend Johnson shouldn't have been made, but it also means that in struggle, things become more concrete. It's not just ideational and in the world of ideas and some platonic world of forms and so on, you see. And that to me is so very important, and for me, that three-step that I talked about. Once I can take on some real organizational pull, then we've got it. I mean, DSA, we decided in 1987 we were going to make national health care a major issue. People laughed at us. Now, of course, DSA was not in any way fully, primarily responsible for making health care, even though we had people in the warfare campaign that pushed it strong. But now that it is, we can talk seriously about the role of insurance companies. We can talk seriously about the 37 million who are uninsured and the 57 who are underinsured, and so the impact of the relative lack of quality health care in inner cities and so forth becomes a major issue. You use it as a springboard to hook in with other kinds of issues, you see. So that begins to get at what you're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Two more questions, and then we're in. You all have been very patient. How you doing, man?
Hi. Once again, you're right about not having public discourse and conversation. Nowadays, it really is rare to hear the ideas you're expressing presented in such a form of forums in general. And that's what my question's about. It seems like that since the time when you had your formative years, when you were maybe my age,
how old are you?
I'm 24.
Oh yeah, okay, that's a long time ago.
We know it. It seems like voices like yours, that were once very loud are now muted. And in the past, where there were conflicts between the Black Panther Party and Karenga, today what we hear is Karenga, and the Black Panther Party has not been resurrected from the dead in a meaningful way. And we no longer hear out loud voices like Angela Davis. We no longer hear about... We do, that's right. But we are a very small number of people.
You mean the Rush Limbaugh crowd doesn't hear too much about that? No, but just the mass majority of Americans across the
Angela
board.
Davis is no longer in the national consciousness. People who speak progressive ideas are, the way I see it, are even worse off as time goes by, not better off. And I'm looking for an explanation as to why that's the case, because I don't think it's because the ideas that are posed against, say, your ideas or against those ideas, then those ideas are not more powerful. There's something else that's causing this. And I just want to hear your comments on that.
No, I appreciate your point. I think you make an important point. One is, we have to recognize that we are emerging out of an ice age in terms of the way in which the conservative elites in our society have so shaped the public conversation and public debate. It's pushed it so far to the right that it's made it very, very difficult for progressives to gain a foothold in that conversation. So it's true, Angela Davis, Committee of Correspondence, very important organization. Right? But it's hard for them to gain access to the larger debate so that people's minds and hearts and souls can be exposed to her visions and analysis. Same would be true in terms of DSA. Same would be true in terms of a whole host of progressives in this regard. So that the Times themselves push the discourse so far to the right that to talk about the kinds of issues that I'm talking about in relation to public life meant that you were lunatic fringe. Lunatic fringe. And yet thousands and thousands and thousands of persons in Industrial Areas Foundation and ACORN and Common Concern and NAACP and progressive black nationalist organizations, womanist organizations, feminist organizations, anti-homophobic organizations, ecological organizations, they have still been laboring in the vineyard, struggling, but still pushed to the margins, you see. And one hopes that, things begin to change. And I think we have some signs of things beginning to change. But we're going to have to go so much further in this regard.
Thank you for doing your part against the lunatic mainstream.
Lunatic mainstream, I like that, yeah. All right, thank you very much. How you doing?
I just want to thank you again for coming to UMass.
I appreciate it.
In the study of philosophy with regard to the writings of European philosophers such as Kant, Hegel, and Socrates, is there a need for emphasis on the study of an African philosophy within our educational institution? And if there is, I just wanted to know what your opinions were.
Appreciate that. Well, one is that I believe that we all should hold to the notion that nothing human is alien to us, which is to say that we should engage in study of a variety of different civilizations, cultures, and the philosophical reflections that emerge out of those civilizations and cultures. Now, for me, you see, I refuse to engage in the study of philosophy without understanding the history of the societies out of which those philosophies flow. Not because I think that philosophy is simply reduced to the conditions and circumstances, but I do believe they are deeply shaped by those conditions and circumstances. And therefore, for me, when I talk about history of civilizations, cultures, societies, and the various philosophical reflections of different sorts within those contexts, it means that we ought to be open across the board to Asian, African, indigenous peoples, what have you. One of the reasons why I tend to focus so much on the New World is because my own particular choices in relation to intellectual work as it links to the black freedom struggle and radical democracy means that I've got to come to terms with modernity. And modernity happens to be, as you know, a moment in which the Europeanization of the world is proceeding. And those nations between the Ural Mountains and Atlantic Oceans are trying to shape the world within their own image. And hence white supremacy and imperialism and colonialism play a fundamental role, as well as science and technology and nation states and markets and bureaucracies and a whole host of other things, you see. So that I think that African philosophies are indispensable in terms of understanding a particular slice of humanity and how they've come to terms with being who they are, conceiving their relation to cosmos and society and so on. And yet at the same time, the vantage point from which one studies those civilizations and cultures and what have you have to be based on certain choices that one makes based on one's own orientation toward the world. You see, so as a radical Democrat, or even as a Christian, you see, I decide to look at each and every civilization and culture from the vantage point of ordinary people struggling and their sufferings, or for Christians through the lens of the cross, blood flowing, heartache, heartbreak, sadness, sorrow, and responds to that suffering, you see. And therefore, when I study African philosophies, for example, in Egypt, in fact, Milana and I talk about this all the time. We always have these debates, you know, about Egyptian philosophy and so on. And we talk about, well, the pyramids, yes, seventh wonders of the world. I don't know how, no one knows how, in fact, it could have been built. But the other relevant question is, did the ordinary people want to build them? Were they coerced to do it? You see? And if they were built, could ordinary people's lives actually be in the pyramids, or was it just for the pharaohs? Pharaohs had to be elites. We can talk about achievement, we can talk about accomplishment, but you always keep track of those everyday people who are producing the wealth for the elites to build their monuments, usually monuments for themselves, you see. The vantage point from which one studies. Can one still appreciate the complexities of the hieroglyphics? My God, yes. Very much so. Can one appreciate the various cosmological views of what one sees among the Phoenicians and the Egyptians and so forth? My God, yes. Nothing human is alien to us. But for me, it's always a matter of ultimately linking it to my own radical democratic project, so that we don't lose sight of the scars and bruises of the folk who often, in those moments of the past, were rendered invisible. You see? And that's a challenge, but I think a very important one to meet intellectually. You see? Intellectually. We talk about Plato this and Plato that. Yes, he did, in fact, in many ways, you know, incarnate a certain kind of theoretical reflection in dramatic prose, yes, but the chain of being and its hierarchy and the ways in which he could provide ideological justifications for subjugation and subordination and infanticide and a whole host of other things must be talked about alongside the dialectical dexterity and delicacy that we see in terms of his own work. And that's true for masters at Timbuktu. That's true for the great Arabist scholars in the University of Paris, medieval period. It's true for the great Asian scholars, and so forth and so on. So it becomes a vantage point from which one studies these various philosophies, as it were. Now that's still to say that our curriculum, these institutions, have so far to go to come to terms with what I'm talking about. Because they themselves have been linked for so long to a certain form of elite formation in the United States. And so it's going to be a long struggle. Thank you all so much.
Okay, at this time, Cornel West is willing to sign. You can purchase and have a book signed. He has the book Race Matters and a new book, Keeping the Faith. Thank you once again. Yes, all proceeds from the book sales go to the Black Student Union.